Nice to be here today. I'm going to talk to you about sustaining organizational transformation. And I'm going to talk about basically a case study in the Australian public sector. And to give you a bit of an idea of who I am, I guess if I needed to pigeonhole myself, I am a strategic designer. Before I moved to Paris, worked in the public sector in Australia. So leading innovation teams and design teams in government agencies. And so I did this body of work in a particular government agency, and to give you a bit of an idea of how this came about, this case study, was that once I started the body of work, and this is a picture of my team over there. While we're doing all our design work in the organization, I noticed a lot of tension going on and a lot of problems, which of course most of us here would understand when you're trying to transform an organization. And so I tried to understand a little bit better why this was happening. So I just educated myself, read a lot of books, went to conferences, listened to podcasts. There was this one particular book, Designing with and Within Government Organizations, and in the Netherlands I actually met the author, which is in that picture there. And I think that was the moment where I decided, you know what, I'm actually going to study this in a very rigorous and academic way. So I decided to actually do this case study as a master's research thesis. So this is an academic body of research. I hope it's not going to be too boring for this audience here, because I know this is not an academic conference. But my motivation behind it was that I felt there's, particularly in government, when you are spending taxpayers' money to do this body of work, I feel that there are a lot of lessons to be learned from it. And if we don't document it somehow so that we can learn from it for other situations, it seems to be a bit of a shame, because I think time and time again the same issues occur. So that was one of my motivations, but also I was just curious to know if there is an answer to this problem. So I wanted to do it in a scholarly fashion. So if you will bear with me and indulge in this deep case study with empirical work on this particular organization. To give you a bit of an idea of what the organization was, the organization, I'm going to call it PSA, Public Sector Agency, and it's an Australian federal government agency, and it provides services to businesses. So it's a service delivery agency, and it provides these services in the form of information, advice, or funding. It's not a very big organization. It's only about 1,000 employees, but it's complex in the sense that it's highly distributed. So we had 80 offices around the world. 50% of our staff were onshore in Australia, 50% were overseas. So it was quite a culturally diverse organization. And 50% of the employees were client-facing employees. And this is an important factor when I come to tell you a little bit more about it. How did this transformation come to be? There was a new CEO that got appointed in 2017. The CEO comes from the private sector, familiar with what human-centered design is, comes into the organization and says, you know what, we've been offering these services for, I don't know, half a century to organizations. Surely the world has moved on. And how do we know if we're still providing the right services to these companies? So why don't we pull together an innovation team and let's do it in a designerly fashion, actually do some design research and find out what our clients actually want, and are we delivering that? So it's a good start. And then the CEO also commissioned an independent review where they also said, you know, with the changing times, you guys need to also modernize a little bit. You're doing a great job, but you just need to get on with the times. So not a bad idea to look at your organization and the services that you're offering. So this is how it started, the transformation. Although it took another year before I was employed as the innovation lead in the organization, or the design lead. So the first thing that happened was that the CEO was quite fascinated by Jeff Moore's Zone to Win, and so decided, you know what, we need this incubation zone for the innovation to happen while we're still doing BAU in the other parts of the organization. So the CEO then decided, you know what, I'm going to create this new structure in the organization. There were 2 deputy CEOs looking after different aspects of the organization. But I'm going to create this new little silo here in the middle, and we're going to call it the client group. And I'm going to put someone at the head of this that will report directly to me, and this is going to be the Chief Client Officer. So this is where my team sat in the client group. So my next slide is a bit messy. Don't freak out, and I don't really, you don't have to read it all, but it's just to give you a bit of a sense of how messy the process was. So it's a timeline of things that happened. You don't have to read it all, but I'm just going to point out some interesting things that happened. So from the time the new CEO came on board, it took about a year before the design team was hired. And when I was hired, it was kind of put to me like this. And I'd been working in government for a long time, but it was sold to me as, Nina, you come along to this job, you get to pick your own team, you can hire your own team, we have a fantastic budget, and you get to do design research from scratch, which will inform us in terms of what services we're going to design. To any designer in middle management and government, that is a dream, because often you inherit a team and you can't really do much with it. I got to choose my team, so I thought, wow, this is a dream job. Okay, this looks good, and they're open to design research. That's good too. So I'm going to have a good time here. When I started, one of the first things they told me after I joined was, actually, we've already got a roadmap. We know what we want to do. But yes, go and do your user research. When you do your user research, though, I want you to, you've got 4 months. And we want you to do a really thorough body of research. You don't have a team yet, but build your team, but you have 4 months. Recruitment in government takes some time. So this was a challenging time. But in the meantime, and all those green lines at the top, were all different consultancies that the agency brought on to help with different aspects of the organization. So interestingly, they brought on an agency to help with human-centered design, even though I was the design lead internally. But they said, oh, it's really just to give you a helping hand because you don't have a team yet, so you know, they can help with the research. And yes, it certainly was helpful. But with every consultancy that comes in, they have their own little approach that they bring in, their own templates that they bring in, and look at the mess that that created with all those different consultancies that came on at different times. What I also find interesting, and I know there are a lot of consultants in this room, and I am actually right now consulting myself, but I have a love-hate relationship with some of these consultancies. On one hand, I can see the value. On the other hand, gee, it's a pain in the backside when they come into the organization. And if you're the internal innovation lead, and yet a consultancy comes in and they have direct access to the CEO, I don't get my voice heard. They do. They produce their nice, shiny report and get out of there. And then it comes down to my team. Oh, can you implement this nice, shiny report? No, I can't implement that nice, shiny report. Now you got me started. But this slide is really just to demonstrate how messy it was. It wasn't quite the dream job that I thought it was going to be. It was quite a challenge. However, I still got to do my design research. I still got to produce, you know, as designers do, their personas and their journey maps. But there were certainly challenges because when we did we interviewed about 100 different CEOs and business decision makers and companies, so it was a thorough body of research. When we produced those personas and journey maps, I remember telling the chief client officer, well, now's a good time for us because, we keep saying, this persona, Bob, he's a business owner, and he does this, and he needs help with this particular aspect. And people are kind of, the employees of the organization looking at us, who's Bob? And I imagine if you're a designer, you've come across this, right? Because sometimes it's not that clear that this is just a hypothetical situation, or it's an aggregation of a range of different data points, and you've created this persona. So at some point I said to the chief client officer, it would be a really good idea if we could translate this for the organization and tell them, what does this mean for you and your job? And I was told, that's not your job. We have an internal communications team. Let them do it. Then we hired change management consultancy. Whoa, now that was fun, because as you know, change management consultancies are very much about scientific methodology, and that really clashes with designerly ways of working. We're moving from A to B, and therefore these are the exact milestones that we have to hit in this time frame, and therefore you need to report to the executive on these particular dates, and these are the milestones you have to hit. And that was really tricky too, because it just created all the wrong incentives in the organization, and things went a bit weird. At this point also, there was a decision made to build up some multidisciplinary teams. That's what the MDTs are. And my job really just became about building and coaching those teams. Each multidisciplinary team made up of a range of different design expertise. So I had interaction designers, content designers, user researchers, service designers, agile coaches, all come together with subject matter experts from the organization to basically work on the new services based on that body of research we did. Although this was tricky also, because when I needed subject matter experts to come from the different parts of the organization, that wasn't quite easy either. The executives of those particular silos weren't very happy to lend me some of their staff members, because they had their KPIs and they had to deliver on their KPIs, and so they couldn't really see the value in helping out with this. A lot of friction, and this was not the ideal situation. So I want to talk a little bit about methodology that I used once I started doing this academic case study, and the data sources that I used for it. So first of all, being a designer, a practitioner in the organization, of course, reflection and action is part of what I do. So my field notes and keeping track of how things were going as events were unfolding was important. That was a data point. I did qualitative research with the executives in the organization. I did about 10 very in-depth interviews with them, and I presented some of the results from that to the executive committee, which informed the next phase of areas that I felt I needed to explore a bit more, which was mainly with middle managers. So I did another 7 interviews there. But on top of that, I also had access to organizational documents. So, meeting notes, decision papers, reports from the gazillion consultancies that we had, and so forth. So I acknowledge my positionality in this research. Of course, it doesn't come without bias, because I was the lead designer in the organization, so I'm clearly biased by what needed to happen and what I considered success. But I also recognize that the pros of that was that I did have access to pretty in-depth data. So I feel that the case study has a lot of empirical data that I've pulled on. And in terms of the literature areas that I covered, public sector innovation, design, and organizational change and transformation, and the most important was, of course, that intersection in the middle. So where it touched on strategic design, organizational culture, learning, and design-driven organization. And it's a really interesting body of work. And in terms of how that came about, I won't go into detail here. The most important thing after triangulating all the different data points that I had was that I ran it through the lens of a piece of study that was done, a framework that was done in Finland. I'll talk about this framework. It talks about the depth and the width of design in an organization, which I guess is the main takeaway from this talk if anybody wants to sort of lessons learned from this particular case study. This is the paper. It was published in 2020. And it talks about basically the co-evolution of the depth and the width of design in an organization. And it's only through this co-evolution that you can actually be a design-driven and get the most out of the benefits of design in an organization. The depth refers to the deep expertise in design, and the width refers to the widespread understanding of design within and the appreciation of design within the organization. And the scaffolds that basically pull it together. And they talk about how impactful it would be if you had sort of different levels of depth and width. Of course, the highest impact is when you have both. So, my key findings. And I've decided I'm not going to go into this in the interest of time, but there were 9 key insights. Let's just skip this for the time being. But the key findings from those 9 insights, when I looked at it through this lens of this framework of depth and width of design, were these 3 things. And I'll talk about this because it probably sounds weird when you look at that and go, is that a typo? What the hell's thrownness? It's the concept of thrownness is the concept of being thrown into a situation. It's the concept of finding yourself late to an event and you're trying to catch up. You don't start with a clean slate. And I imagine if you're a designer sitting in this audience, this is typically your experience, because when you go into an organization to do a body of work, you don't start from a clean slate. Even I didn't, even though they promised me, you can hire your own team, you can start from scratch, you can do design research. It wasn't quite like that either. And there was no time to really reframe some of the questions that they were asking. Because, for example, a decision was already made that we needed to digitize some of the services. But in a way, they wanted the design research to justify that decision. And I'm not saying the research didn't, but you know, it didn't negate it, but it didn't specifically say you need to digitize your services either. So it's interesting that some decisions were made, and this is the point I'm making about thrownness. As a designer coming into an organization, you're thrown into the situation, and sometimes you just find yourself catching up. The second key finding is about introduction of design into organizational strategy, and this talks a little bit to the presentation first thing this morning. Wolfgang talked about it in terms of the flight levels, and I think this is referring to that. So it's all fine to have design, doing some design research, but if your strategy in terms of prioritizing the body of work that needs to happen or KPIs that are set, for example, when I couldn't get subject matter experts onto those multidisciplinary teams because of the conflict in KPIs, that's an issue, right? Because design wasn't used in the strategy. And then thirdly, the soft side of design. And this was interesting because it actually came out of one of the interviews with the executives, where they referred to it as, we had too much design and not enough strategy. And I was trying to dig a little bit deeper. Now, what do you mean by that? Oh, you know, designers, they're all creative. And if you knew me a year ago, I would totally fit that hippy-dippy look too, because I also had very long dreadlocks. And so I lived the persona also. But that was the view that they had, is that, okay, there's no hard edge skills in design. You know, we needed hard edge skills. And it made me look a little bit deeper in terms of what does this mean when they're talking about the soft side of design. And when I dug a little deeper into it, I recognized that actually, if the softer side of design, creativity, intuition, these things that designers are super good at, was given a stronger voice, actually this transformation would have been a lot more successful because, and I'm going to talk about that because it touches on organizational culture. I love this quote. It's not from my interviews, but I just wanted to share it here because it's from that paper of that framework. And it says basically, because that body of work was a study of tech companies, and it was a pretty thorough analysis of a bunch of tech companies when they came up with the depth and width framework. But when they interviewed this VP of innovation of a Fortune 500 company, and he says, execution is all about problem solving. Here's a problem, solve it. And that's what our companies are good at. Creativity is all about problem finding. So what is the problem here that we are solving? And when you're looking at every one of us in the company environment, do you prefer an employee that when you say, here's a problem, they come up and give you a solution? Or do you prefer an employee that when you say, here's a problem, they come up with 5 other problems? And here's a dilemma for designers, right? Because not everyone's open to reframing the problem and coming up with more problems. They want solutions. And so what this particular VP is talking about is all our incentive structures of reviewing people and so forth is all around this, is all around problem solving. So with the concept of thrownness that I explained to you, it begs the question for me, how might we create the space and time at the outset of design initiatives to better understand the context and to ask the right questions? Who has agency to challenge decision makers on whether they're asking the right questions? When I was hired, within the first week, I noticed, oh, they've already made a bunch of decisions here, and I thought I had a clean slate, but I didn't. But it's also, and I know from other designer colleagues, that is often the case. You can't really go up to them and start challenging them about, but are you asking the right questions when you've just been hired to solve a particular problem? So that's a tricky situation. And in regards to design and strategy, this was a quote from one of the interviews from an executive, and he was referring to the meta-service task, and he said, you know, we were missing this. And even though he's not using the words, he's actually referring to using the strategic element was missing from that body of transformational work. And so begs the question, how might the design methods in an organization influence strategic management? Who has the agency to demonstrate the benefits of integrating design and strategic conversations? And in terms of the soft side of design, how might design play a role in changing these fundamental assumptions and behaviors for the benefit of the organizational transformation, and who has agency to do that? And I want to now dig a little bit deeper into this particular aspect because I think organizational culture plays a huge role in this. These are quotes from my interviews, and I'm not going to talk about them. I'm not going to read them all out, but if you could, ooh, have I got not the wrong button, the right button, that's it. Read this one if you want to. But basically, it's referring to the culture of me-ism versus the culture of us-ism. And this is actually a quote from one of the executives in the organization saying, you know, we were all protecting our patches. They could reflect on this and they could tell that they were doing it. And yet it was a problem for the transformation to progress because their KPIs were not what's for the greater good of the organization. Their KPIs were for the projects that had their name on it. So that was one aspect of the culture of this organization. And the other aspect was putting on a good show. And I think this comes from the organization being deeply rooted in promotion and marketing, because it's basically helping companies with their trading endeavors and also attracting foreign direct investment into the country. And so they have to promote, for example, Australia. And so that's a little bit in the DNA and the culture of the organization. Putting on a good show came up in the sense of when we were asked at some point, all staff meetings, to talk about what's going well and what isn't going well. And even though I told the managers, when you're going to give this presentation, pick 2 things that worked and 2 things that didn't work, nobody talked about 2 things that didn't work, nobody. And that's even though that was what I had specifically asked them to do. And I think that was deeply rooted in the culture of this organization. They couldn't talk about things that weren't working. It also came up in the context of, I tried to bring in showcasing work to regularly show people the body of work that was happening in these multidisciplinary teams, and to get real-time feedback so we could implement them as we were prototyping and moving forward. And some of the comments I got was, well, hang on, why don't you just show us when it's done? Why are you showing us work in progress? And so a different culture. This was embedded in the culture. And if you haven't read Amy Edmondson's work, she's amazing in terms of organizational failures. And she talks about failing intelligently, which is basically any deviation from an expected outcome, whether it's positive or negative, is a good thing to learn from for the organization. And you don't have to wait for the big disasters to happen to then pause and reflect and say, oh, what could we have done differently there? Those little deviations give us a lot of affordance for learning as well. And I think we don't do enough of this, certainly not in government. And then this Peter Drucker quote, of course, was thrown around all the time in my interviews. The executive in the organization would regularly say it, culture eats strategy for breakfast. Nobody did anything about it, interestingly. And so Shine, who's a psychologist, I think you were talking about Shine yesterday, talks about this. Inattention to social systems and organizations has led researchers to underestimate the importance of culture, shared norms, values, assumption, and how an organization functions. And it comes down to that thrownness again. When you come into an organization as a designer, do you have time to just quickly assess what the culture of the organization is so you can adjust things accordingly? There's a really interesting story about two young fish swimming around, and they bump into an older fish, and the older fish goes, "Hey, fellas, how's the water?" And they go, "What water? What is he talking about?" And so there's the concept of when you're in and of a culture, sometimes you don't even recognize that you're part of it until you're exposed to a different kind. I won't read this out, but I just wanted to highlight the Rousseau's model of basically the onion layers of organizational culture and the fundamental assumptions that are basically at the center of that. And so I feel the soft side of design, that creativity and intuition and trying to work with people. There were many talks yesterday about this. How do you build trust with people? It all comes down to that soft skills that designers have. And I think if you want to address some of the fundamental assumptions in an organization, that's how you can do it. I don't think the hard-edged tools work on that. And so what is the key finding of this 2-year body of research that I did? God knows why I decided to write a thesis on this, but I did. And so my finding was that the width of design, we had the depth of design in this organization. We had so many designers. I had a pretty healthy budget. I hired really awesome people that came in and worked on different aspects. But we didn't have the width of design in the organization, and therefore the impact of the design work was not fully realized. How do you achieve the width of design in an organization? And this is what that particular framework talks about in terms of scaffolds. So when I look at my empirical data from my interviews and my data points, and I look at that framework, this is what I came up with. Be the designerly voice when strategic decisions are being made. Some people just say, have a designer at the decision table, at the executive. In a way, we kind of had that chief client officer, but our chief client officer wasn't a designer. And I'll come to this point in a minute. Having a voice of authority in design, because when you have different groups working on design stuff, and there isn't one point to make a final decision, it causes friction. Having a role or a function in the organization that's comfortable with boundary objects, the visual artifacts that you can use to basically communicate the inputs and outputs of design with different functions of the organization and proactively use it in the right context. This would be important for internal comms, for change management. able to integrate various perspectives. So I think this role or function that may do this needs to also know enough about the organization and pick out points in time where it would make sense to bring in those different perspectives. Have oversight of design capability in the organization, know when to bring in expertise from the outside, but also nourish and develop the internal capability of design. And you need someone who looks after that aspect, because you also need to keep track of the quality of design that's being used across the organization. Codifying design processes is referring to a formalized process. When you have a formalized process, then you get better value out of it, because then everybody follows the same process. And remember that messy diagram I showed with different consultancies coming in with their own templates and so forth? If you have different processes, you kind of dilute the value in the end also. And maintain this overall sense of whole of design initiatives. Let them go with the creativity on separate projects, but maintain the whole. And some people refer to as, some of the academic literature talks about it in terms of, I'm probably going to mispronounce this for the Germans in the audience, design gestalt, is that correct? So keeping the overall whole, sense of whole. And I'm just going to quickly run through this. Proactively seek opportunities for other employees in the organization to get involved in the design aspects. Be the custodian of design artifacts. So this is actually, how is it going to be maintained and stored and used in induction for new employees? How is it going to be used for internal comms and so forth? And then be responsible for the promotion of rituals of pause and reflect, which designers are really good at being reflexive, but you need to build that into the organizational culture. This is the failing intelligently part. So in the end, I just want to say that it's good to have a function that can oversee those scaffolds. And I'm going to leave you with this quote that says, that came from one of my interviews: what you don't do much of, you don't get good at. We don't do a lot of transformation and culture change in government, so how are we supposed to get better at it? So I'm hoping that by documenting this particular case study, maybe there's some lessons learned for other people who might want to do the same thing. Thank you.
Thank you, Nina. Very, very beautiful narrative. I'm going to go first and ask about the soft skills of design. It makes me wonder, do you find design to be an inherently feminine discipline? And I don't mean gendered as male and men and women, but skill-wise. I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
I think it's really dangerous to combine soft skills with feminism. And so I don't think so. The soft side of design is looking more at the skills in terms of creativity and building trust and intuition. And I wouldn't necessarily combine those two things.
Beautiful, thank you. Anyone else?
Well, first of all, thank you for using the expression culture eats strategy for breakfast, because that's one of my favorite. So many people don't understand how culture will actually have a bigger influence than what they think on whatever operational or design activities. But my question for you is, aren't we in a waiting game here? Because the business people, you know, the decision makers, so to speak, I don't think they are very interested and don't understand quickly what design is all about. They think it's beautiful and not functional and actually solving problems. But at the same time, I speak to a lot of designers and I speak a lot to business people, and they have very different languages and very different perceptions of one another. So do you feel that design people should get more interested into the decision making, the strategic aspect so that when they get to the table, design is not just only the conversation, but is a tool in the toolbox so that the strategy and culture, they can really be the main focus here.
Thank you. That's a really good point, and I think you're right. There is a different language and a different way of working that is at odds, and particularly with change management and scientific methodology. And so there is actually a big body of work. There's even within the design discipline, and my literature review, if you care to read 150 pages of my thesis, talks about this, because even within the discipline of design, we don't speak the same language. And there's even, you know, do you call yourself do you work in human-centered design, user-centered design? Are you a service designer? And there's slight tweaks on these even, but to somebody who's not in the discipline of design, it's really confusing. And then on top of that, it's at odds with scientific management, some of the aspects. And so we need to bridge that gap. And I think in the end, what I'm talking about with the width of design in an organization is how do you build that broader understanding of design within an organization so that it can have the impact more broadly on strategy and culture and so forth. But I feel like that is a particular function and a role that has to happen in an organization. Even as the design lead and the innovation lead in this agency that I was, I didn't have that authority. I didn't have that level of influence in the organization to do that. And even though I would try, I called them my stealth projects, where even though my manager would say, no, Nina, internal comms is not for you. You focus on, do your user research, do this, leave that to the comms team. I'd go have a coffee with the comms team. Who was talking about this yesterday when they said they used to go to the gym at lunchtime just to build trust with... And do you know what I did? I picked up running. I hate running. And one of the executives was a runner. And I decided, you know what? I'm going to run with this executive. Once a week, we do a 5K run, which nearly killed me. Because not only, I didn't go for the love of running, I went because I wanted to talk to the person. Can you imagine a non-runner running 5Ks and trying to have an effective conversation? Things designers do. I used to call these my stealth projects because I was trying to build that level of trust, but also influence in that way. I don't know how effective it is in the end. That's why I think there's a function that needs to oversee that aspect of translating and bringing the width of design.
Beautiful.
In my experience, government organizations tend to be quite hierarchical. I don't know whether yours was similar. I just wondered whether you think that also increases the distance, if you like, between the strategy layer and the sort of operational, how it's actually done on the ground.
That's a really good point, and I did think about that a lot. And I thought, because government's been put in place to basically, you know, make sure the checks and balances are done. You're accountable for public money that you're spending, so you can't just go about things willy-nilly. And in a way, I think sometimes private sector can get away with some things. They don't have to report on it, just sweep it under the carpet, no one will ever know. In public service, it's not like that, which you're right. Then that causes another layer of bureaucracy on top of things. Having said that, I think the findings of my research, I didn't think it was specific to public sector. I think it was specific to big organizations. Because that siloed nature of how things work, and particularly when it comes to KPIs and prioritizing and strategy, if you're undergoing a big organizational transformation, I think that might actually be quite relevant to a private sector company just as much as the public sector. So to me, it was a big organization problem. It wasn't specific to the public sector.
Thank you so much, Nina. I know and feel we could continue this, and I hope we will. But to wrap this up for now, thank you so much for a wonderful talk.